All right, I'm gonna start reading in about a minute. Just wanna get make sure I announce it on my Twitter as I'm starting and pinning this to my profile. Okie dokie. Pinned profile. We're done. Done. Okay. Let's see if anyone wants to join the call first. Attack helicopter cat. You stole the laser pointer off of one of their the Star's guns, didn't you? You stole it from Leon's gun. There's like a laser aim. When playing the game Resident Evil 4, there's an aim laser attached to any of the weapon that you equip. So yeah. Okay. Right. Copy. See if anyone wants to join the call before I go ahead and start chapter 6. Is it evil? The Umbrella Conspiracy. I hope everyone is doing well tonight. I had a long work shift. I don't really want to say anything about how it ended. I'm just going to say it was not pleasant. I'm just glad that's been over. Been looking forward to tonight's stream all day. Okay. Also, message night shift. Done. Okie dokie. JC just says, speaking of laser pointers, that reminds me, for whatever reason, I might know who Trent works for. The merchant from Resident Evil 4. That's a good guess. Interesting guess. What are you buying, stranger? Trent offers one of his gadgets to the merchant. Buy it at a high price. All right. Okay, I'm gonna start reading now. Let's get into it. Yeah. I know from where we left off. The first of the zombies have already been mentioned, and everyone is all split up. Wesker is gone. Yeah, that's right. Jill and Barry in the Spencer mansion. They were gonna get back to Wesker, and and he's nowhere around in the foyer, what the entrance area. Almost at the right chapter. Come on, there we go. Yep. Yep. Wesker is gone. Okay, I found the right chapter. Chapter 6. Wesker! Barry shouted, his deep voice echoing through the chilly room. Captain Wesker! He jogged toward a row of arches at the back of the hall, calling to Jill over his shoulder as he ran. Don't leave the room! Jill walked to the stairs, feeling almost dizzy. First Chris, now the captain. They hadn't been gone 5 minutes, and he'd said he was going to stay put. Why would he have left? She looked around for signs of a struggle, a spent cartridge, a spot of blood. There was nothing to indicate what might have happened. Barry appeared on the other side of the giant staircase, shaking his head and walking slowly to join her. Jill bit her lower lip, frowning. You think Wesker ran into one of those things? She asked. Barry sighed. I don't think RPD showed and snuck him out, though if he did run into trouble, we would not have heard the shots. Not necessarily. He could have been ambushed, dragged away. They stood silently for a moment, thinking. Jill was still a bit Jill was still a bit shaken from the face to face with the walking corpse, but thought she'd accepted the facts pretty well. The woods bordering Raccoon City had become infested with zombies. After a lifetime of reading trashy novels about serial killers, is a cannibal zombie so hard to swallow? Somehow it wasn't, and neither were the murderous dogs or the secretly kept estate. There was no question that it at all existed. The question was, why? Did the mansion have anything to do with the murders, or had the zombies simply overrun it like they'd overrun Raccoon Forest? And was that creature the last thing Becky and Chris saw? She rejected that thought almost violently. Thinking about the girls now would be a mistake. So, do we go looking or do we wait? Jill said finally. Go looking. Ken made it here. The rest of the Bravos could be somewhere in this house. It'd be easy enough to get lost. Chris. He half smiled, though Jill could see the worry in his eyes. Chris and Wesker got sidetracked, but we'll find them. It'll take more than a couple of walking stiffs to cause either of them any grief. He reached into a pocket in his vest and pulled out something wrapped in a handkerchief. Handing it to her, she felt the thin metal objects beneath the light fabric and recognized them instantly. It's the sets you gave to me to practice with last month, he said. I figure you'll have better luck with them. Jill nodded, tucking the lockpicks into her hip pouch. Barry had taken an interest in her former career, and she'd given him a few pieces from her old set, several picks and torsion bars. They could come in handy. The small bundle settled on top of something hard and smooth. Trent's computer! In all the excitement, she'd totally forgotten about her strange encounter in the locker room. She opened her mouth to tell Barry, then shut it, remembering Trent's cryptic warning. I wouldn't mention this conversation to anyone. Screw that. She'd almost risked it anyway with Chris. And where is Chris now? Who's to say that Trent's dire consequences haven't already occurred? Jill realized what she was thinking and had to fight off an urge to laugh at herself. What had happened with Trent probably wasn't even relevant to their predicament, and whether or not she could trust Barry, she knew she couldn't trust Trent. Still, she decided not to say anything about it, at least until she had a chance to see what the computer held. I think we should split up, Barry continued. I know it's dangerous, but we need to cover a lot of ground. We find anybody, we meet back here and use this room as a base. Rubbing at his beard, he fixed her with a serious gaze. You up for this, Jill? We could search together. No, you're right, she said. I can take the West Wing. Unlike cops, stars seldom partnered. They were trained to watch their own backs in dangerous situations. Barry nodded. Okay, I'll go back and see if I can persuade one of those doors open. Keep an eye out for a back exit, conserve ammo, and be careful. You too. Barry grinned, holding up his Colt Python. I'll be fine. There was nothing left to say. Jill headed straight for the set of doors on the west wall that Wesker hadn't tried earlier. Behind her, Barry hurried back to the dining room. She heard the door open and close, leaving her alone. Here goes nothing. The painted blue doors opened smoothly, revealing a small, shadowy room as cool and silent as the main hall, all in shades of blue. Muted track lighting illuminated framed paintings on dusky walls, and in the center of the room was a large statue of a woman holding an urn on one shoulder. Jill closed the door behind her and let her eyes adjust to the gloom, noting the two doors opposite the one she'd come through. The one on the left was open, though a small chest was pushed in front of it, blocking access. It was unlikely that Wesker had gone that way. She walked to the one on the right and tried the knob. Locked. Sighing, she reached into her pack for the picks and then hesitated, feeling the smooth weight of the mini disc reader. Let's see what Mr. Trent thinks is so important. She slipped it out and studied it a moment, then tapped at a switch. A screen the size of a baseball card flickered to life, and with a few more taps, small lines of type scrolled across the monitor. She scanned the material, recognizing the names and dates from local newspapers. Trent had apparently compiled every article he could find about the murders and disappearances in Raccoon, plus the pieces on the stars. Nothing new here. Jill skipped along, wondering what the point was. After the articles was a list of names: William Birkin, Steve Keller, Michael Dees, John Howe, Martin Crackhorn, Henry Sarton, Ellen Smith, Bill Robertson. She frowned. None of the names were familiar except, wasn't Bill Robinson Chris's friend? The one who had worked for Umbrella? She couldn't be sure. She'd have to ask Chris, assuming we'd find him. This was a waste of time. She needed to start looking for the other stars. She pressed the forwarding key to get to the end of the data, and a picture appeared. Tiny lines set into patterns. There were squares and long rectangles, crosshatched with smaller marks that connected the empty boxes. Beneath it was a single line, a message as enigmatic as she could have expected from Mr. Trent. Night keys, tiger eyes, 4 chests, gate of new life.
East Eagle, West Wolf. Gee, how illuminating. That just clears up everything, doesn't it? The picture was some kind of map, she decided. It looked like a floor plan. The biggest area was at the center, a slightly smaller one extending off to the left. Jill suddenly felt her heart skip a beat. She stared down at the small screen, wondering how Trent had known. It was the mansion's first floor. She tapped the floor button again and saw what could only be the second floor, the shapes corresponding to the first map. There was nothing after the second map, but it was enough. As far as she was concerned, there was no longer any question that the Spencer estate was the source of the terror in Raccoon City, which meant that the answers were here, waiting to be uncovered. The zombie groaned as Chris fired point blank into its gut twice. The shots were muffled by its rancid flesh, and it fell against him, expelling a rush of foul, stinking air across his face. Chris pushed it away, the back of his throat locking. His hands and the barrel of his weapon were dripping with sticky fluids. The creature collapsed to the floor, its limbs spasming. Chris backed away, wiping the Beretta against his vest as he took deep breaths, trying to desperately not to vomit. The zombie out in the hall had been a desiccated mess, shriveled and dry. This one was fresh, if that was the right word, festering, necrotic, wet. He swallowed hard, and the urge to throw up slowly passed. Didn't have a particularly weak stomach, but that smell, God! Keep it together. Could be more of them. The hall he entered was all dark wood and dim light. For the moment there was no sound except the pulse of blood in his ears. He looked down at the body, wondering exactly what it was, what it had been. He had felt its hot, fetid breath against his face. It wasn't a reanimated corpse, no matter what it looked like. He decided it didn't matter. For all intents and purposes, it was a zombie. It had tried to bite him, and creatures like it had already chowed down on some of Raccoon's population. He needed to find his way back to the others, and they had to get out and get help. They didn't have the firepower to handle the situation alone. He ejected the empty clip from the gummy weapon and quickly reloaded, his chest tightening with stress. 15 rounds left. He had a bowie knife, but the thought of going against a zombie with only a knife wasn't all that appealing. There was a plain looking door to his left. Chris pulled at the knob, but it was locked. He squinted at the key plate and wasn't all that surprised to see an etching of what looked like armor, sword armor. There was a definite theme developing. He moved down the wide hall, listening for any sound and taking frequent deep breaths through his nose. The goo on his vest and hands made it hard to tell if there were any more of them around. The smell was all over him, but it could be his only chance to avoid another close encounter. The hall turned to the left, and he took the corner fast, sweeping the Beretta across the wide wooden expanse. There was a support pillar partially blocking his view, but he could see the back of a man just past it, the slumped shoulders and stained clothes of one of the creatures. Chris quickly edged to the right, trying to get a clear shot. The zombie was maybe 40 feet away, and he didn't want to waste his last rounds. At the sound of his boots against the hardwood floor, it turned, shuffling slowly, so slowly that Chris hesitated, watching the way it moved. This one seemed to have been dipped in a thin layer of slime, dull light reflecting off its glistening skin as it stumbled almost blindly toward Chris. It slowly raised its arms, its pale, hairless skull wobbling on its emaciated neck. Silently, it shuffled forward. Chris took a sliding step to his left, and the zombie changed direction, veering toward him eagerly, closing the distance between them at a slow walk, just like in the movies, dangerous but dumb, and easy to outrun. He had to save ammo in case he got cornered. There were stairs at the end of the hall, and Chris took a deep breath, readying himself. He stepped back, giving him enough room to maneuver, and heard a gasping moan behind him, a fresh wave of rancid stink assaulting his senses. He spun around, the realization hitting him before he knew it. The festering zombie was only a few feet away, reaching for him, bits of its putrid guts spilling out across its shattered abdomen. He hadn't killed it, hadn't waited long enough to make sure, and his stupidity was about to cost him. Ah, shit! Chris sprinted away and down the corridor, dodging both of them and cursing himself. He passed the thick support beam, almost to the stairs, and stopped cold, seeing what waited at the top. He caught only a glimpse of the ragged creature standing at the head of the stairs, and spun away, raising his weapon to face the attackers that shambled toward him hungrily. From the shadows beneath the steps came a heavy, gurgling sigh and the scruffing of wood. Another one. He was trapped, and there was no way he could kill them all. Door! It faced the side of the stairs, the dark wood blending so well that the shadows that he almost hadn't seen it. Chris ran for it, grabbing at the handle, praying that it would open as around him the creatures closed in. If it was locked, he was dead. Rebecca Chambers had never been more afraid, not once in her 18 years. For what seemed like an eternity, she listened to the soft scrape of rotting flesh brushing against the door and tried desperately to think of a plan, her dread building with each passing minute. There was no lock on the door, and she'd lost her handgun on the run for the house. The small storage room, though well stocked with chemicals and stacks of papers, had offered nothing to use as a defense except a half empty can of insect repellent. It was the can she gripped now, standing behind the door of the tiny room. If or when the monsters finally figured out how to use the doorknob, she planned on spraying it in their eyes and then making a run for it. Maybe they'll be laughing so hard that I'll have a chance to slip past. Bug spray, great weapon. She'd heard what could have been shots somewhere close by, but they weren't repeated. Her hope that it was one of the team faded as the seconds ticked past, and she was starting to give serious consideration to the concept that she was the only one left when she when the door burst open and a gasping figure hurtled inside. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She leaped forward and pressed the button, releasing a cloud of chemical mist into its face, tensing herself to run past it. Gah! It yelled, and it fell back against the door, slamming it shut. It covered its eyes, spluttering. It wasn't a monster. She just maced one of the alphas. Oh no! Rebecca was already reaching into her field medical kit, her immense relief at seeing another of the stars battling with monumental embarrassment. She fumbled out a clean cloth and a tiny squeezed bottle of water, stepping toward him. Keep your eyes closed. Don't rub at them. The alpha dropped his hands, face red, and she finally recognized him. It was Chris Redfield, only the most attractive guy in the stars, not to mention her superior. She felt herself blush, and was suddenly glad that he couldn't see her. Nice going, Rebecca. Way to make a good impression on your first operation. Lose your gun, get lost, blind a teammate. She led him over to the small cot in the corner of the room and sat him down, letting her training take over. Lean your head back. This is going to sting a little, but it's just water, okay? She dabbed at his eyes with the damp cloth, relieved that she hadn't sprayed him with anything worse. What was that stuff? stuff, he said, blinking rapidly. Tears and water streamed down his face, but there didn't seem to be any damage. Bug repellent. The label's been ripped off, but the active ingredient is probably permethrin. It's an irritant, but the effect shouldn't last long. I lost my gun, and when you came in, I thought you were one of those things. Though if they hadn't figured out how to use a doorknob by now, they probably won't. She realized she was babbling and shut up, finishing the crude irrigation and stepping back. Chris wiped his face and peered up at her with bloodshot eyes. Rebecca Chambers, right? She she nodded miserably. Yeah, look, I'm really sorry. Don't worry about it, he said and smiled. Not a bad weapon, actually. He stood up and looked around the small room, frowning. There wasn't much to see. An open trunk full of papers, a shelf lined with bottles of mostly unlabeled chemicals, a cot, and a desk. Rebecca had been through it all in her search for something to use against the creatures. What about the rest of your team? He asked. Rebecca shook her head. I don't know. Something went wrong with the helicopter, and we had to set down. We were attacked by animals, some kind of dogs, and Enrico told us to run for cover. She shrugged, suddenly feeling like she was about 12 years old. I got turned around in the woods and ended up at the front door of this place. I think one of the others broke it down. It was open. She trailed off, looking away from his intense gaze. The rest was probably obvious. She had no weapon. She'd gotten lost. She ended up here. All in all, a pretty poor showing. Hey, he said softly, there's nothing else you could have done. Enrico said to run. You ran. You followed orders. There's creatures out there, the zombies. They're all over the place. I got lost too. And the rest of the alphas could be anywhere. Trust me, just the fact that you made it this far. Outside, one of the monsters let out a low, plaintive wail, and Chris stopped talking, his expression grim. Rebecca shuddered. So what do we do now? We look for the others and try to find a way out. He sighed, looking down at his weapon. Except you don't have a gun, and I'm almost out of ammo. Rebecca brightened and reached into her hip pack. She pulled out two full magazines and handed them over, pleased that she had something to offer him. Oh, and I found this on the desk, she said, and produced a silver key with a sword on it. She didn't know what it unlocked, but thought it might be useful. Chris stared at it thoughtfully, then slipped it into a pocket. He walked to the open trunk and looked down at the stacks of papers. He rifled through them, frowning. Your background's in biochemistry, right? Have you looked through these? Rebecca joined him, shaking her head. Barely. I've been kind of busy watching the door. He handed her one of the papers, and she scanned it quickly. It was a list of neurotransmitters and level indicators. Brain chemistry, she said. But these numbers are all screwed up. The serotonin and the norepinephrine are too low. But look here, the dopamine is off on the chart, and we're talking big time schizo. She noted the incredulous look on his face and smiled a little. Being an 18-year-old college grad, she got a lot of that. The stars had recruited her right after graduation, promising her a whole team of researchers and a lab of her own to study molecular biology, her real passion, provided, of course, that she went through the basic training and got some field experience. No one else had shown much interest in hiring a whiz kid. There was a soft thump at the door, and her smile faded. She was getting experience, all right. Chris fished the sword key out of his pocket and looked at her seriously. I passed the door with a sword engraved on the over the keyhole. I'm going to check it out, see if it leads back to the main hall. I want you to stay here and go through those files. Maybe there's something we can use. Her uncertainty must have showed in her face. He smiled gently, his voice low and soothing. I've got plenty of ammo, thanks to you, and I won't be gone long. She nodded, making a conscious effort to relax. She was scared, but letting him see it wasn't going to help matters. He was probably scared too. He walked to the door, still talking. The RPD should be here any time, so if I don't come back right away, just wait here. He raised the weapon, putting his other hand on the knob. Get ready. As soon as I'm out, move the trunk in front of the door. I'll give a yell when I get back. Rebecca nodded again, and with a final quick smile, Chris opened the door and looked both ways before moving out into the hall. She closed the door and leaned against it, listening. After long seconds of silence, she heard the rattle of gunfire not far away, 5 or 6 shots, then nothing. After a few minutes, she moved the trunk to block the part of the door, edging it in front of the hinges so she could push it out of the way easily. She knelt in front of it, trying to clear her thoughts as she started looking through the papers, trying not to feel as young and unsure as she actually felt. Sighing, she pulled out a handful of papers and started to read. End of chapter 6. And I got a DM. Uh, Attack Helicopter Cat just showed me a cute cat meme. Mom, they called me fat. You're not fat, you're just fluffy. Aw, that's adorable. That gets a sparkly heart. Oh, Jeff Baum has arrived. Hey. Hello. No one else yet? Okie doke. I want to check something for a second. Nope, no one. Nope. Okay. 4 messages. Meh. Okay. Let's go into chapter 7 then. Yeah, so Rebecca Chambers, she is now in. Now her appearances uh makes it a little more interesting. Okay, let's see what's going on in chapter 7. The lock was a piece of cake, 3 flat tumblers in a single row. Jill could have opened it with a couple of paper clips. According to the map, the door would open into a long hall. Sure enough, she took another look at the pocket computer screen and then slipped it into her pack, thinking. It looked like there was a back way out, through several halls and past a series of rooms. She could look for Wesker and the others along the way, and maybe secure an escape route at the same time. She stepped into the narrow corridor, the fully loaded Beretta in hand. It was a study in weirdness. The hall wasn't all that spectacular, the carpet runner and the wallpaper done in basic tans and browns, the wide windows showing only the darkness outside. The display chests that lined the inner wall, though. There were 3 of them, each topped by a small lamp, and each prominently displaying a wide array of bleached human bones on open shelves, interspersed with small items of obscurity. Jill started down the hall, stopping briefly at each bizarre spectacle. Skulls, arm and leg bones, hands and feet. There were at least 3 complete skeletons, and amidst the pale and pitted bones were feathers, clay beads, gnarled strips of leather. Jill picked up one of the leather strips and then put it down quickly, wiping her fingers on her pants. She couldn't be sure, but it felt like she imagined tan, cured human skin would feel stiff and kind of greasy. Crash! The window behind her exploded inward, a lithe, sinewy form lunging into the hall, growling and snapping. It was one of the mutant killing hounds, its eyes as red as its dripping hide. It charged her, its teeth as bright and dangerous as the jagged glitter of glass still falling from the shattered frame. Backed between the two chests, Jill fired. The angle was wrong, and the bullet splintering the wood at her feet as the dog jumped at her, growling deep in its throat. It hit her in the thighs, slamming her painfully against the wall, gnashing to get its jaws at her flesh. The smell of rotting meat washed over her, and she fired again and again, barely aware that she was moaning in fear and disgust, a sound as guttural and primal as the furious dying shrieks that came from the canine abomination. The fifth bullet fired directly into its barrel chest and knocked it away. With a final, almost puppyish yelp, it crumpled to the floor, blood gushing into the tanned carpet. Jill kept her weapon trained on the still form, gulping air in huge, shuddery breaths. Its limbs twitched suddenly, its massive claws beating a brief tattoo across the wet, red floor before it lay still again. Jill relaxed, recognizing the movement as death spasm, the body releasing life. She'd have bruises, but the dog was dead. She brushed her bangs out of her eyes and crouched down next to it, taking in the strange exposed musculature and huge jaws. It had been too dark and hectic on the run to the house to get a good look at the things that had killed Joseph. But in the bright light of the corridor, her initial impression wasn't changed. It looked like a skinned dog. She stood up and backed away, warily eyeing the row of windows in the hall. Obviously, they offered no protection from the hazards outside. The corridor took a sharp left, and she hurried on, past more of the macabre, macabre displays that decorated the inner wall. The door at the end of the long hall was unlocked. It opened into another hall, not as well lit as the first, but at least not as creepy either. The muted gray green wallpaper sported paintings of generic scenery and gentle landscapes, not a bone or fetish in sight. The first door on the right was locked, a carving of armor on the key plate. Joe remembered the list on the computer, something about night keys, but decided not to bother with it for now. According to Trent's map, there was a room on the other side that didn't lead anywhere. Besides, if Wesker had come this way, she didn't imagine that he was locking doors behind him. Right, just like it was unlikely that Chris would disappear. Don't assume anything about this place. The next door she tried opened into a small bathroom with an antique feel, complete with a ceiling fan and an old fashioned 4-footed tub. There was no sign of recent use. She stood for a moment in the stale, tiny room, breathing deeply, feeling the aftermath of the adrenaline rush she had in the corridor. Growing up, she'd learned how to enjoy the thrill of danger, of sneaking in and out of strange places with only a handful of tools and her own wits to keep her safe. Since joining the stars, that youthful excitement had faded away, lost to the realities of backup and handguns. But here it was again, unexpected and not welcome. She couldn't lie to herself about the simple joy that often followed facing death and walking away. She felt good, alive. Let's not have a let's not have a party just yet, her mind whispered sarcastically. Or have you forgotten that stars are being eaten in this hellhole? Jill stepped back into the silent hallway and edged around another corner, wondering if Barry had found Chris and if either of them had run across any of the Bravos. She felt like she had an advantage with the maps and decided that once she checked out the possible escape, She'd go back to the main hall and wait for Barry. With the information on Trent's computer, they could search more quickly and thoroughly. The corridor ended with two doors facing each other. The one on the right was the one she wanted. She tried the handle and was rewarded with the soft snick of the bolt retracting. She stepped into a dark hall and saw one of the zombies, a hulking, pale shadow, standing next to a door, maybe 10 feet away. As she raised her weapon, the creature started toward her, emitting soft hunger sounds from its decaying lips. One of its arms hung limply at its side, and although Jill could see a jagged bone protruding from the shoulder, it still clenched and unclenched its rotting fist eagerly as it reached out with its other arm. The head. Aim for the head. The shots were incredibly loud in the chilly room, the first blowing off its left ear, the second and third punching holes into its skull just above its pallid brow. Dark fluid streamed down the peeling face, and it fell to its knees, its flat, lifeless eyes rolling back into its head. There was shuffling movement in the shadows, at the back of the hall to the right, exactly where she meant to go. Jill trained the gun on the darkness and waited for it to move closer, her entire body wired with tension. How many of these things are there? As soon as she As soon as the zombie cleared the corner, she fired, the Beretta jumping lightly in her sweating hands. The second shot punctured its right eye and immediately collapsed to the dark, polished wood of the floor. The sticky, viscous matter of the brown eyeball flecked across its skeletal face. Jill waited, but other than the spreading pools of blood around the dead creatures, nothing moved. Breathing through her mouth to avoid the worst of the stench, she hurried to the back of the hall and turned right, down a short, tight passage that dead ended at a rusting metal door. It creaked open, and fresh air flooded past her, warm and clean after the morgue like chill of the house. Jill grinned, hearing the drone of cicadas and crickets on the night air. She'd reached the final leg of her little excursion, and although she wasn't outside yet, the sounds and smells of the forest renewed her sense of accomplishment. Got a secured path now, straight to the back of this place. We can head north, hit one of the logging roads, and hike down to the barricade. She stepped out onto a covered walkway, a mosaic of green stone surrounded by high concrete walls. There were small, intermittent openings near the ceiling of the pathway, accounting for the faint, pine scented breeze. Ivy trickled down from the arched openings like a reminder of the outside world. She hurried down the dim passage, remembering from the map that there was a single room at the end and to the right, probably a storage shed. She turned the corner and stopped at another heavy-looking metal door, her smile fading as she reflexively tried for the handle. The keyhole was plugged. She crouched and poked at the tiny hole, but to no avail. Someone had stopped it up with epoxy. The left of the door was some kind of diagram set into the concrete made of dull copper. There were four hexagonal depressions on the metal on the in the flat metal plate, each fist-sized hole connected to the next by a thin line. Jill squinted at the legend etched beneath, wishing that she had a flashlight as she struggled to make out the words. She brushed a thin layer of dust off the indented words and tried again. When the sun sets in the west and the moon rises in the east, stars will begin to appear in the sky, and wind will blow toward the ground. Then the gate of new life will open. She blinked. Four holes. Trent's list. Four crests. Something about the gate of new life. It's a combination mechanism for the lock. Place the four crests, the door opens, except that means I have to find them first. Jill pushed against the door and felt her hope fizzle out completely. Not even a rattle, no give at all. They were going to have to find another way out unless the crests could be found, and which in this place could take years. A lone howl rose in the distance, and was joined by the echoing cries of the dogs near the mansion. The strange, yodeling sounds piercing the gentle quiet of the woods. There had to be dozens of them out there, and Jill realized suddenly that escaping out the back door probably wasn't such a hot idea. She had limited ammunition for her handgun, and no doubts that there were more ghoulish creatures wandering the halls, shuffling about in hungry, mindless silence as they searched for their next grisly meal. She sighed heavily and started back to the house, already dreading the cold stench of death and trying to prepare herself for the dangers that seemed to lurk at every corner. The stars were trapped. Chris knew he had to make the ammo count, so when he left Rebecca, he took off through the dim corridor at a full run, his boots pounding at the wood floor. There were still only three of them, all grouped near the stairs. He dodged past them easily and sprinted down the hall and around the corner. As soon as he got to the door that led back to the other hall, he turned and assumed a classic shooter's stance, supporting his gun hand at the wrist, his finger on the trigger. One by one, the zombies reeled around the corner, groaning and stumbling. Chris took careful aim, breathing evenly, keeping his focus. He squeezed the trigger, sending two bullets through the gangrenous nose of the first. Without pausing, he sent a third shot into the center of the next zombie's forehead. Fluid and soft matter sprayed the wall behind them as the bullets slapped into the wood. Even as they crumpled to the floor, he found his mark on the third creature. Two more muted explosions, and the zombie's brow caved inward, dropping it like the bag of bones that it was. Chris lowered the Beretta, feeling a rush of pride. He was a high ranked marksman, even had a couple of awards to show for it, but it was still good to see what he could do when given enough time to aim. His quick draw wasn't nearly as strong. That was Barry's forte. He reached for the door handle, urged into action by the thought of all that was at stake. He figured the Alphas could take care of themselves. They had as much of a chance as he did, but this was Rebecca's first operation, and she didn't even have a gun. He needed to get her out. He stepped back into the soft light of the hall with the green wallpaper, quickly checking both directions. Straight ahead, the corridor was in heavier shadow. No way to tell if it was clear. To his right was the door with the sword on the key plate, and the first zombie he'd shot, still sprawled lifelessly across the floor. Chris was gratified to see that it hadn't moved. Apparently, headshots were the best way to kill a zombie, just like in the movies. Chris edged toward the sword door, training his weapon left, then right, then left again. He had enough surprises for one day. He checked the small offshoot across from the door, and seeing that it was clear, quickly inserted the slender key into the lock. It turned smoothly. Chris stepped into a small bedroom, only slightly better lit than the corridor. A single bright lamp on the desk in one corner. It was all clear, unless there was something hiding under the narrow cot, or maybe in the closet from the desk. He shuddered, closing the door behind him. It was every kid's first set of fears, and had been his too. Monsters in the closet, and the thing that lived under the bed, waiting for the careless child's ankle to come within reach. And you're how old now? Chris shook off the case of the nerves, embarrassed at his imaginative wanderings. He walked slowly around the room, looking for anything that might be helpful. There was no other door, no path back to the main hall, but maybe he could find a better weapon for Rebecca than a can of bug spray. Besides an oak table and bookshelf, there was the small unmade bed and a study desk in the room, nothing more. He quickly rifled through the books, then moved around the foot of the bed to the desk. There was a slim volume next to the desk lamp, the fabric cover untitled, a journal. And although the desktop was coated in dust, the diary had been moved recently. Intrigued, Chris picked it up and flipped to the last few pages. Maybe there was a clue as to what the hell was going on. He sat on the edge of the cot and started to read. May 9th, 1998. Played poker tonight with Scott and Alias from security and Steve from research. Steve was the big winner, but I think he was cheating, scumbag. Chris smiled a little at that. He skipped down to the next entry and his smile froze, his heart seeming to pause in mid-beat. May 10th, 1998. One of the higher ups assigned me to take care of a new experiment. It looks like a skinned gorilla. Feeding instructions were to give it live animals. When I threw in a pig, the creature seemed to play with it, tearing off the pig's legs and pulling out the guts before it actually started eating. Experiment? Could the writer be talking about the zombies? Chris read on, excited by the find. The diary was obviously belonged to someone who worked here. Had to be, meaning that the cover up was even bigger than he'd suspected. May 11th, 1998. Around 5 a.m., Scott woke me up. Scared the shit out of me, too. He was wearing a protective garment that looked like a spacesuit. He handed me another one and told me to put it on, said there'd been an accident in the basement lab. I just knew something like this would happen. Those assholes in research never rest, even at night. May 12th, 1998. I've been wearing the damn spacesuit since yesterday. My skin's getting grimy and feels itchy all over. The goddamn dogs have been looking at me funny, so I decided not to feed them today. Screw 'em. May 13th, 1998. Went to the infirmary because my back is all swollen and feels itchy. They put a big bandage on it and told me I didn't need to wear the suit anymore. All I want to do is sleep. May 14th, 1998. Found another blister on my foot this morning. I ended up dragging my foot all the way to the dog's pen. They were quiet all day, which is weird. Then I realized some of them had escaped. If anybody finds out, I'll have my head handed to me. May 15th, 1998. My first day off in a long time and I feel like shit. Decided to go visit Nancy anyway, but when I tried to leave the estate, I was stopped by the guards. They said the company's ordered that no one leaves the grounds. I can't even make a phone call. All the phones have been ripped out. What kind of bullshit is this? May 16th, 1998. Rumors going around that a researcher who tried to escape the estate last night was shot. My entire body feels hot and itchy, and I'm sweating all the time now. I scratched at the swelling on my arm, and a piece of rotten flesh just dropped off. Wasn't that wasn't until I realized the smell was making me hungry that I got violently sick. The writing had become shaky. Chris turned the page and could barely read the last few lines. The words scrawled haphazardly across the paper. May 19th. Fever gone, but itchy. Hungry and eat doggy food. Itchy, itchy Scott. Came ugly face, so killed him. Tasty. For itchy. Tasty. The rest of the pages were blank. Chris stood up and slipped the journal inside his vest, his thoughts racing. Some of the pieces were finally fitting into place. Secret research at a secretly kept estate, an accident in a hidden lab, an escaped virus or infection of some kind that altered the people working here, changing them into ghouls. And some of them got out. The murders and attacks on raccoons started in late May, coinciding with the effects of the accident. The chronology made sense, but exactly what kind of research was being done here, and how deeply involved was Umbrella? Who involved? How involved was Billy? He didn't want to think about that, but even as he tried to clear his mind of the thoughts, a new one occurred to him. What if it was still contagious? He hurried to the door, suddenly desperate to get back to Rebecca with the news. With her training, maybe she could figure out what had been unleashed in the secret lab on the estate. Chris swallowed heavily. Even now, he and the other stars could be infected. And JC says, "Ah, the itchy tasty scene. One of the best scenes in survival horror history." Mm-hmm. Well, there you go. There's one of the classic lines from the classic parts from the first game mentioned in the novel. All right. Okie dokie. I'm gonna take a drink. All right. Chapter 8. After Jill and Barry went their separate ways, Wesker had stayed crouched on the balcony in the main hall, thinking. He knew that time was of the essence, but he wanted to outline a few possible scenarios before he acted. He'd already made mistakes and didn't want to make any more of them. The Raccoon Alphas were a great group, making his margin for error very slim indeed. He received his orders a couple of days ago, but hadn't expected to be in a position to carry them out so soon. The Bravo team's copter going down had been a fluke, as had Brad Vickers' sudden display of cowardice. Still, he should have been more prepared. Being caught with his pants down like this went against his grain. It was so unprofessional. He sighed, putting the thoughts aside. There'd be time for self recrimination later. He hadn't expected to end up here, but here he was, and kicking himself for a lack of foresight wasn't going to change anything. Besides, there was too much to do. He knew the grounds of the state fairly well, and the labs like the back of his hand, but he'd only been inside the mansion a few times, and not at all since he'd been officially transferred to Raccoon City. The place was a maze, designed by a genius architect at the bidding of a madman. Spencer was bats, no two ways about it, and he'd had the house built with all kinds of tricky little mechanisms, a lot of that silly spy crap that had been so popular in the late 60s. Spy crap that's going to make this job twice as hard as it needs to be. Hidden keys, secret tunnels, it's like I'm trapped in an espionage thriller, complete with mad scientists and a ticking clock. His original plan had been to lead both the Alpha and Bravo teams to the estate and to clear the area before he proceeded to the lower labs and wrapped things up. He had the master keys and codes, of course. They had been sent along with his orders and would open most of the doors on the estate. The problem was, there was no key to the door that led to the garden. It had a puzzled lock, and was currently the only way to get to the labs outside of walking through the woods, which ain't gonna happen. The dogs would be on me before I could take 2 steps, and if the 100 if the 121s got out, Wesker shuddered, remembering the incident with the rookie guard who'd gotten too close to one of the cages a year or so back. The kid had been dead before he could even open his mouth to call for help. Wesker had no intention of going back outside without an army to back him up. The last contact with the estate had been over 6 weeks ago. An hysterical call from Michael Dees to one of the suits in the White Office. The doctor had sealed the mansion, hiding the 4 pieces of the puzzle lock in a fruitless effort to keep any more of the virus carriers from reaching the house. By then, they were all infected and suffering from a kind of paranoid mania, one of the more charming side effects of the virus. God only knew what tricks and traps the researchers down in the labs had screwed with as they slowly lost their minds. Dees had been no exception, although he had managed to hold out longer than most of the others. Something to do with individual metabolism, or so Wesker had been told. The company had already decided to call a complete wipe, though the babbling scientist had been assured that help was on the way. Wesker had enjoyed a good laugh over that one. There was no way the white boys would risk further infection. They'd sat on their hands for almost 2 months while raccoons suffer the consequences, letting the incompetent RPD investigate while the virus gradually lost its punch, and then sent him to clean up the mess, which by now was considerable. The captain absently ran his fingers across the plush carpet, trying to remember details of the briefing about Dee's call. Whether he liked it or not, everything had to be taken care of tonight. He had to collect the required evidence and get to the labs, and that meant finding the pieces of the puzzle lock. Dees had been mostly incoherent, ranting about murderous crows and giant spiders, but he had insisted that the crest keys to the puzzle lock were hidden where only Spencer could find them. And that made sense. Everyone who worked in the house knew about Spencer's penchant for cloak and dagger mechanisms. Unfortunately for Wesker, he hadn't bothered learning much about the mansion, since he never thought he'd need the information. He remembered a few of the more colorful hiding places. The statue of the tiger with mismatched eyes came to mind, as did the armor display room with the gas and secret room in the library. But I don't have time to go through all of them, not by myself. Wesker grinned suddenly and stood up, amazed that he hadn't thought of it already. Who said he'd had to be by himself? He ditched the stars to map out a new plan and search for the crests, but there was no reason that he had to do everything. Chris wasn't viable. He was too gung ho, and Jill was still an unknown quantity. Barry, though. Barry Burton was a family man, and both Jill and Chris trusted him. And while they're all still fumbling around in the house, I can get to the triggering system, then get the hell out. Mission complete. Still grinning, Wesker walked to the door that led to the dining room back balcony, surprised to find that he was looking forward to his little adventure. It was a chance to test his skills against the rest of the team and against the accidental test subjects that were surely still lurching around, not to mention old Spencer himself. And if he pulled it off, he was going to be a very rich man. This might actually turn out to be fun. End of chapter 8. Okay. Yep, still good for everyone else. I think it's been a while since I've been through this book. I still like it. Still pretty good read. Back to Jill in chapter 9. Caw! Jill whipped her Beretta toward the sound. The mournful shriek echoing around the door slipped closed behind her. Then she saw the source of the noise and relaxed, smiling nervously. What the hell are they doing in here? She was still in the back part of the house and had decided to check out a few of the other rooms before heading back to the main hall. The first door she'd tried had been locked, a carving of a helmet on the key plate. uh, her picks had been useless, the luck a type she'd never encountered, so she decided to try her luck on the door across the hall. It had opened easily enough, and she'd gone in ready for anything, though about the last thing she'd expected to see was a flock of crows perched along the support bar for the track lighting that ran the length of the room. Another of the large black birds let out its morose shriek, and Jill shivered at the sound. There were at least a dozen of them, ruffling their shiny feathers and watching her with bright, beady eyes as she quickly surveyed the room for threats. It was clear. The U-shaped chamber she'd entered was as cold as the rest of the house, perhaps colder, and empty of furniture. It was a viewing hall, nothing but portraits and paintings lining the inner wall. Black feathers lay scattered across the worn wooden floor amidst dried mounds of bird droppings. And Jill wondered again how the crows had gotten inside and how long they'd been there. There was definitely something strange about their appearance. They seemed much larger than normal crows, and they studied her with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. Jill shivered again, turning back toward the door. There wasn't anything important in the room, and the birds were giving her the creeps. Time to move on. She glanced at a few of the paintings on her way out, mostly portraits, noticing that there were switches beneath the heavy frames. She assumed they were for the track lighting, though she couldn't imagine why anyone had bothered setting up such an elaborate gallery for such mediocre art. A baby, a young man. The paintings weren't awful, but they weren't exactly inspired either. She stopped as she touched the cold metal handle of the door, frowning. There was a small inset control panel set at eye level to the right of the door, labeled Spots. She punched one of the buttons, and the room dimmed as a single directional light went out. Several of the crows barked their disapproval, fluttering ebony wings, and Jill turned the light back on, thinking, so if these are the light switches, what are the controls beneath the paintings for? Perhaps there was more to the room than she'd thought. She walked to the first picture across from the door, a large painting of flying angels and clouds shot with sunbeams. The title was From Cradle to Grave. There wasn't a switch below it, and Jill moved to the next. It was a portrait of a middle-aged man, his lined features sagging with exhaustion, standing next to an elaborate fireplace. From the cut of his suit and his slicked back hair, it looked to have been painted in the late 1940s or early 50s. There was a simple on-off switch underneath, unlabeled. Jill flicked it from the left to right and heard an electrical snap, and behind her the crows exploded into screaming motion, rising as a one from their brooding perch. As she could hear All she could hear was the beat of their dark wings and the sudden manic ferocity of their cries as they swarmed toward her. And Jill ran, the door seeming a million miles away, her heart pounding. The first of the crows reached her as she grabbed for the handle, its claws finding the soft skin at the back of her neck. There was a sharp stab of pain just beneath her right ear, and Jill flailed at the rustling feathers that brushed her cheeks. Moaning as the furious shrieks enveloped her, she slapped at the air behind her and was rewarded with a startled squawk of surprise. The bird let go of her, reeling away. Too many! Out, out, out! She jerked the door open and fell into the hallway, kicking the door closed. Even as she hit the floor, she lay there a moment, catching her breath, relishing the cool silence of the corridor in spite of zombie stench. None of the crows had gotten out. As her heartbeat returned to something approaching normal, she sat up and carefully touched the wound behind her ear. Her fingers came away wet, but it wasn't too bad. The blood was already clotting. She'd been lucky. When she thought of what could have happened if she'd tripped and fallen, why had they attacked? What had the control switch done? She remembered the snap of electricity when she flipped it, the sound of a spark. The perch! She felt a sudden rush of grudging admiration for whoever had set up the simple trap. When she'd hit the switch, she must have sent a current through the metal bar they'd been perched on. She'd never heard of attacked trained crows, but could think of no other explanation, which meant that someone had gone through a lot of trouble to keep whatever was in that room a secret. To get to the answer, she'd have to go back in. I could stand in the doorway, take them out one at a time. She didn't much like the idea. She didn't trust her aim, and would certainly waste a lot of ammunition. Only fools accept the obvious and go no further. Use your brain, Jilly. She smiled a little. It was her father talking, reminding her of the training she had before the stars. One of her earliest memories was of hiding in the bushes outside the rickety old house in Massachusetts that her father had rented for them, studying the dark, empty windows as he explained how to properly case a prospect. Dick made it into a game, teaching her over the next 10 years all the finer points of breaking and entering, everything from how to remove panes of glass without damaging them to walking on stairs so they didn't creak. And he'd also taught her again and again that every riddle had more than one answer. Killing the birds was too obvious. She closed her eyes, concentrating. Switches and portraits. A little boy, a toddler, a young man, a middle aged man. From cradle to grave, cradle to grave. Once the solution occurred to her, she was almost embarrassed by the simplicity of it. She stood up and dusted herself off, wondering how long it would take for the crows to return to their roost. Once they were settled, she shouldn't have any more problems uncovering the secret. She cracked the door open and listened to the whispering beat of wings, promising herself to be more careful this time. Pushing the wrong button in this house could be deadly. Rebecca, let me in, it's Chris. There was the sound of something heavy sliding against the wall, and the door to the storage room creaked open. Rebecca stepped away from the entrance as he hurried inside, already pulling the diary out of his vest. I found this journal in one of the rooms, he said. It looks like there was some kind of research going on here. I don't know what kind, but viral virology. Rebecca interrupted and held up a stack of papers, grinning. You were right about there being something useful in here. Chris took the papers from her and skimmed the first page. As far as he could tell, it was in a foreign language made out of numbers and letters. What is all this stuff? DH5A-MCR? What you're looking at is a strain chart, Rebecca said brightly. That's one that one's a host for generating genomic libraries containing methylated cytosine or adenine residues, depending. Chris cocked an eyebrow at her. Let's pretend that I have no idea what you're talking about and try again. What did you find? Rebecca flushed slightly and took the papers back from him. Sorry. Basically, there's a lot of stuff in here on viral infection. Chris nodded. That I understand. A virus. He quickly flipped through the journal, counting the dates from the first report of the accident in the lab. On May 11th, there was some kind of spill or outbreak in a laboratory on this estate. Within 8 or 9 days, whoever wrote this had turned into one of those creatures out there. Rebecca's eyes widened. Does it say when the first symptoms appeared? Looks like within 24 hours he or she was complaining of itchy skin, swelling and blisters within 48 hours. Rebecca paled. That's wow. Chris nodded. Yeah, my thoughts exactly. Is there any way to tell if we couldn't be infected? Not without more information. All of that, Rebecca motioned at the trunk of full of papers, is pretty old. 10 years plus. And there's nothing specific about application, though an airborne with that kind of speed and toxicity. If it was still viable, all of Raccoon City would probably be infected by now. I can't be positive, but I doubt it's still contagious. Chris was relieved for himself and the rest of the stars, but the fact that the zombies were all victims of a disease, it was depressing, whether it was a disaster of their own, making it making or not. We have to find the others, he said. If one of them should stumble across the lab without knowing what's there. Rebecca looked stricken at the thought, but nodded gamely and moved quickly toward the door. Chris decided that, with a little experience, she'd make a first rate STARS member. She obviously knew her chemistry, and even without a gun, she was willing to leave the relative safety of the storage room in order to help the rest of the team. Together they hurried through the dark, wooded hallway, Rebecca sticking close to his side. When they reached the door, back to the first hallway, Chris checked his Beretta and then turned to Rebecca. Stay close. The door we want is to the right and at the end of the hall. I'll probably have to shoot the lock, and I'm pretty sure there's a zombie or two wandering around, so I'll need you to watch my back. Yes, sir, she said quietly, and Chris grinned in spite of the situation. Technically, he was her superior. Still, it was weird to have it pointed out. He opened the door and stepped through, training his gun on the shadows straight ahead and then down the hall to the right. Nothing moved. Go, he whispered, and they jogged down the corridor, quickly stepping over the fallen creature that blocked their path. Rebecca turned to face the open stretch behind them as Chris rattled the doorknob, hoping vainly that it had unlocked itself. No such luck. He backed away from the door and took careful aim. Firing at a locked door wasn't as easy or safe as it looked in the movies. Ricochet off of the metal so that such close range could kill the shooter. Chris! He glanced over his shoulder and saw a shambling figure at the other end of the hall moving slowly toward them. Even in the dim light, Chris could see that one of its arms was missing. The distinctive odor of decay wafted toward them as the zombie moaned in thickly, stumbling forward. Chris turned back to the door and fired twice. The frame splintered. The instant metal square of the lock revealed in a spray of wood chips. He jerked at the knob, and the lock gave, the doors swinging open. He turned and grabbed at Rebecca's arm, hustling her through the doorway as he pointed the Beretta back down the hall. The creature had made it halfway, but was stopped at the lifeless body of the zombie that Chris had killed earlier. Even as Chris watched in horror and disgust, the one-armed zombie dropped to his knees and plunged its remaining hand into the other's crushed skull and moaned again, a wet, phlegmy cell, and brought a handful of slushy gray matter to its eager lips. Oh man. Chris shuddered involuntarily and hurriedly stepped through to join Rebecca, closing the door on the gruesome scene. Rebecca was pale but seemed composed, and again Chris admired her courage. She was young but tough, tougher than he'd been at 18. He took in the hall at a glance, immediately noticing the changes. To their right, about 20 feet away, was the corpse of One of the creatures, the top of its head blown away. It lay face up, the head sockets of its eyes filled with blood. To their left were two doors that Chris hadn't tried when he'd first come to investigate. The one at the very end of the hall was standing open, revealing deep shadows. At least one of the stores, well, at least one of the stars came this way, probably looking for me. Follow me, he said softly, and moved toward the open door, holding the Beretta tightly. He wanted to get back to the main hall with Rebecca, but the fact that one of his team must have gone through the opening deserved a quick look. As they passed through the closed door on the right, Rebecca hesitated. There's a picture of a sword next to the lock, she whispered. He kept his attention on the darkness just past the open door, but realized as she spoke that there were too many ways for them to get sidetracked. He didn't think the rest of the team was still waiting for him, but his original orders had been to report back to the lobby. He shouldn't be leading an unarmed rookie into unknown territory without at least checking. Chris sighed, lowering his weapon. Let's get back to the main hall, he said. We can come back and check it out later. Rebecca nodded, and together they walked back toward the dining room, Chris hoping against hope that someone would be there to meet them. Barry pointed his Colt toward the crawling ghoul and fired, the heavy sound splattering the thing's mushy skull into liquid even as it reached for its boot. Tiny drops of wetness splashed his face as the zombie spasmed and died. Scowling, Barry wiped at his skin with the back of his hand. The tiny white tiles of the kitchen wall got it much worse. Rivulets of red coursing down the grouted tracks and pooling to the faded brown linoleum. Still, it was pretty disgusting. Barry lowered the revolver, feeling the ache in his left shoulder. The door upstairs had been solidly locked. He had the bruises to prove it, and staring down at the zombie hash in front of him, he realized that he was going to have to go back up and break down another one. If he hadn't been certain before, he was now. Chris hadn't come this way. If he had, the crawling creature would already have been history. So where the hell are you, Chris? Of the three locked doors, Barry had picked the one at the end of the hall on pure instinct. He ended up in a dark, silent hall that led past an empty elevator shaft and down a narrow set of stairs. The bare white kitchen at the bottom had seemed deserted, the counters thick with dust and cor- corrosion stains on the walls, no sign of recent use, no sign of Chris, and the single door across from the sink had been locked. He'd been about to leave when he noticed the trails of disturbed dust on the floor and followed them. Sighing heavily, Barry stepped over the stinking monster. A final check before he headed back up for door number two. There were still there were some stacked crates and the same old-fashioned elevator shaft, also empty. He didn't bother with the call button since the one upstairs hadn't worked. Besides, judging from the rust on the metal grate, no one had used it in quite a while. He turned back the way he'd come, wondering how Jill was making out. The sooner they could get away, the better. Barry had never disliked any place as much as he did this mansion. It was cold, it was dangerous, and it smelled like a meat locker that had been unplugged for a week. He generally wasn't the type to frighten easily or let his imagination get out of hand, but he half expected to see some white sheeted spook rattling chains every time he turned around. There was a distant echoing clatter behind him. Barry spun, a knot of dread in his gut as he pointed his weapon randomly at the empty air, his eyes wide and mouth dry. There was another metallic clatter, followed by a low, throbbing hum of machinery. Barry took a deep breath and blew it out slowly, getting a hold of himself. Not a disembodied spirit, after all. Someone was using the elevator. Who? Chris and Wesker are missing, and Jill's in the other wing. He stayed where he was, lowering the Colt slightly as he waited. He didn't think the ghouls were smart enough to work the buttons, let alone open the gate, but he didn't want to take any chances. He was a good 20 feet from where the booth would open, assuming it stopped in the basement, and would have a clear shot at whoever stepped around the corner. A glimmer of hope sparked through his confusion. Maybe it was one of the Bravos, or someone who had lived here and could tell them what had happened. With a dull clang, the elevator stopped in the kitchen. There were there was a squeal of dry metal hinges and footsteps, and Captain Wesker stepped into view, his perpetual sunglasses propped on his tanned brow. Barry lowered the revolver, grinning as cool relief swept over him. Wesker stopped in his tracks and grinned back at him. Barry, just the man I was looking for, he said lightly. God, you gave me a scare. And I heard the elevator start up and I thought I was going to have a heart attack. Barry trailed off, his grin faltering. Captain, he said slowly, where did you go? When we came back, you were gone. Wesker's grin widened. Sorry about that. I had some business to attend to, call of nature. Barry smiled again, but was surprised by the confession. Trapped in hostile territory, and the man had gone off to take a leak? Wesker reached up and lowered his shades, breaking their eye contact, and Barry suddenly felt a little nervous. Wesker's grin, if anything, seemed to grow wider. It looked like every tooth was showing. Barry, I need your help. Have you ever heard of White Umbrella? Barry shook his head, feeling more uncomfortable by the second. White Umbrella is a sector of Umbrella Incorporated, a very important division. They specialize in biological research, I guess you could say. The Spencer estate houses their research facilities, and recently an accident occurred. Wesker brushed off a section of the kitchen's center island and casually leaned against it, his tone almost conversational. This division of Umbrella has a few ties to the STARS organization, and not long ago I was asked to assist in their handling of the situation. It's a very delicate situation, mind you, very hush hush. White Umbrella doesn't want a whisper of their involvement getting out. Now, what I'm supposed to do is get to the laboratories on the ground here and put an end to some rather incriminating evidence, proof that White Umbrella is responsible for the accident that's caused so much trouble in Raccoon as of late. The problem is, I don't have the key to get to those labs. Keys, actually. And that's where you come in. I need for you to help me find those keys. Barry stared at him for a moment, speechless, his mind churning. An accident, a secret lab doing biological research, and murdering dogs and zombies loose in the woods. He raised his revolver and pointed it at Wesker's smiling face, stunned and angry. Are you insane? You think I'm going to help you destroy evidence, you crazy son of a bitch? Wesker shook his head slowly, acting as if Barry were a child. Ah, Barry, you don't understand. You don't have a choice in the matter. See, a few of my friends from White Umbrella are currently standing outside of your house, watching your wife and daughters sleep. If you don't help me, your family is going to die. Barry could actually feel the blood drain from his face. He cocked the hammer back on the Colt, feeling the sudden vicious hatred for Wesker infusing every fiber of his being. Before you pull the trigger, I should mention that if I don't report back to my friends fairly soon, their orders are to go ahead and do the deed anyway. The words cut through the red haze that had flooded Barry's mind, turning his hands clammy with terror. Kathy, the babies! You're bluffing, he whispered. And Wesker's grin finally disappeared, his expression slipping back into the unreadable mask that he usually wore. I'm not, he said coldly. Try me. You can apologize to their headstones later. For a moment, neither of them moved, the silence a palpable thing in the chill air. Then Barry slowly eased the hammer back down and lowered the weapon. His shoulders slumped. He wouldn't risk it. His family was everything. Wesker nodded and reached into one of his pockets, producing a ring of keys. His manner was suddenly brisk and businesslike. There are 4 copper plates somewhere in this house. Each one is about the size of a teacup and has a picture engraved on the side: sun, moon, stars, and wind. There's a back door on the other side of the mansion where the 4 of them belong. He unhooked a key from the ring and set it on the table, sliding it across to Barry. This should open all of the doors in the other wing, or at least the important ones, the first and second floor. Find those pieces for me, and your wife and children will be fine. Barry reached for the key with numb fingers, feeling weak and more afraid than he'd ever been in his life. Chris and Jill will undoubtedly want to help you search. If you see either of them, tell them that the back door you've discovered could be the way out. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to work with their trusted friend, good old Barry. In fact, you should unlock every door you can in order to promote a more thorough job. Wesker smiled again, a friendly half grin that belied his words. Of course, you tell them you've seen me. That could complicate matters. If I run into trouble, say get shot in the back, well, enough said. Let's just keep this to ourselves. The key was etched with a little picture, a chest plate for a suit of armor. Barry slipped it into his pocket. Where will you be? Oh, I'll be around. Don't worry. I'll contact you when the time is right. Barry looked at Wesker pleadingly, helpless to keep the wavering feel out of his voice. You'll tell them that I'm helping you, right? You won't forget to report? Wesker turned and walked toward the elevator, calling out over his shoulder, Trust me, Barry. Do what I tell you, and there's nothing to worry about. There was the rattle of the elevator's gate opening and closing, and Wesker was gone. Barry stood a moment longer, staring into the empty space where Wesker had been, trying to find a way out of this, trying to find a way out of the threat. There wasn't one. There was no contest between his honor and his family. He could live without honor. He set his jaw and started and walked back toward the stairs, determined to do what he had to do to save Kathy and the girls. Though when this was over, when he could be sure they were safe, there won't be any place for you to hide, Captain. Barry clenched his giant fists, knuckles whitening, and promised himself that Wesker would pay for what he was doing with interest. Now it's getting intense. Now Wesker, he revealed himself to be the traitor to Barry. Dun dun dun! And the zombies, and mutant dogs, and giant crows. Oh boy. I think there's supposed to be a giant snake and a shark in the story somewhere. Okay. All right. 10th chapter. At least one more chapter. And then we'll just, yeah, one more chapter and then we'll end the stream. All right. Jill slid the heavy copper crest with the engraved star into its position on the diagram, above the other three openings. It settled into place with a light click, flush against the metal plate. One down. She stepped back from the puzzle block, smiling triumphantly. Crows had watched her walk through the hall of paintings without moving from their perch, crying out occasionally as she solved the simple puzzle. There had been 6 portraits in all, cradle to grave, from a newborn baby to a rather stern looking old man. She'd assumed they were all of Lord Spencer, though she'd never seen a photo. The final painting had been a death scene, a pale man lying in state and surrounded by mourners. When she'd slipped the switch on that one, the painting had actually fallen off the wall, pushed out by tiny metal pegs at each corner. Behind it had been a small velvet lined opening that held the copper crest. She'd left the hall without any more trouble. If the birds had been disappointed, she couldn't say. She took a final deep breath of the pleasant night air before going back into the mansion, pulling Trent's computer from her pack as she went. Stepping carefully over the crumpled corpse in the dim hall, she studied the map, deciding where to try next. Back the way she'd come, it looked like. She went back through the double doors that connected the corridors into the winding, mild gray green hall with the landscape paintings. According to the map, a single door just across from her led to a small, square shaped room which opened into a larger one. Tensing, she grabbed the knob and pushed it open, crouching and pointing her beretta at the same time. The small room was indeed square shaped and totally empty. Straightening, Jill stepped into the chamber, briefly appraising its simple elegance as she walked toward the door on her right. It had a high, light ceiling, and the walls were creamy marble flecked with gold. Beautiful and expensive, to say the least. She felt a vague wistfulness for the old days with Dick, all their grand plans and hopes for each score. This was what real money could buy. She readied herself, grasping the cold, flowing metal of the latch and pushing the door open. A quick sweep with the beretta, and she felt herself relax. She was alone. There was a molded fireplace to her right, beneath an ornate red and gold tapestry. A low modern couch and oval coffee table sat atop a burnt orange carpet of Oriental design, and against the back wall a pump-action shotgun was mounted on dual hooks, shining in the light from the unique lamp fixture of her head. Jill grinned and hurried across the room, unable to believe her luck. Please be loaded. Please be loaded. She stepped in front of it. She recognized the make. Guns weren't her strong suit, but it was the same as the stars used. A Remington M870, 5 shots. She holstered the Beretta and lifted the shotgun with both hands, still grinning, and the smile dropped away as the mounting hooks clicked upward, released from the weight of the gun. At the same time, there was a heavier sound behind the wall, a sound like balanced metal changing position. Jill didn't know what it was, but she didn't like it. She turned around quickly, searching the room for movement. It was as still as she entered. No screaming birds, no sudden alarms or flashing lights. None of the pictures fell off the wall. There was no trap. Relieved, she quickly checked the weapon and found it fully loaded. Someone had taken care of it. The barrel clean and smelling faintly of cleaner and oil. Right now, it was about the best smell she could imagine. The solid weight of it in her hands was reassuring, the weight of power. She she searched the rest of the room and was disappointed not to find any more shells. Still, the Remington was a fine. Stars vests had a back holster for a shotgun or rifle, and although she wasn't that hot with and over the shoulder drawer. At least she could carry it without tying up her hands. There was nothing else of interest in the room. Jill walked to the door, excited to get back to the main hall and share her discoveries with Barry. She checked out every room that she could open on the side of the first floor. If he'd managed the same, they could head upstairs to finish their search for the Bravos and their missing teammates, and then hopefully get the hell out of this morgue. She closed the door behind her and strode across the slate colored tiles of the classy marble room, hoping as she grasped the knob, that Barry had found Kristen Wesker. I sure didn't come this way. The door was locked. Jill frowned, turning the small gold knob back and forth. It rattled a little, but wouldn't give at all. She peered at the crack where the door met the frame, suddenly a little anxious. There it was, by the handle, the thick silver steel that indicated a deadbolt, and a very solid one. The entire area surrounding it was reinforced. There only one keyhole, and that's for the knob. Click, click, click. Dust rained down from above as the sound of gears turning filled the room, a deep rhythmic clatter of metal from somewhere behind the stone walls. What? Startled, Jill looked up and felt her stomach shrivel in on itself, her breath catching in her throat. The high ceiling that she'd admired earlier was moving, the marble at the corners powdering into dust with heavy grind of stone against stone. It was coming down. In a flash, she was back at the door to the shotgun room. She snatched at the handle, pushing it down, and found it locked as solidly as the first. Holy shit! Bad thing! Bad thing! Panic rising through her system, Joe ran back to the door, her frightened gaze drawn back to the lowering ceiling. At 2 to 3 inches each second, it hit the floor in less than a minute. Joe raised the shotgun and aimed at the door to the hall, trying not to think about how many shots it would take to blow apart a reinforced steel deadbolt. It was all she had. The picks would work on that kind of luck. The first round exploded against the door, and splinters flew, revealing exactly what she'd feared. The metal plate that supported the bolt extended half a door. Her mind raced for an answer and came up blank. She didn't have the shells to blow through it, and the Beretta carried hollow points. They flattened on impact. Maybe I can weaken it, break it down. She fired again, targeting the frame itself. The thunderous shot tore apart wood and chipped marble, but not enough, not even close. The ceiling continued its clattering descent, now less than 10 feet above her head. She was going to be crushed to death. God, don't let me die like this. Jill, is that you? A muffled voice called from the corridor, and she felt a sudden desperate hope course through her at the sound. Barry! Help! Barry! Break it down! Now! Jill shouted, her voice high and shaking. Get back! Jill stumbled away as she heard a heavy blow strike the door. The wood shuddered but held. Jill let out a low cry of helpless frustration, her terrified gaze jumping between the door and the ceiling. Another solid, shaking hit to the door, 5 feet overhead. Come on, come on! The third pounding blow was joined by the crunching splinter of wood. The door flew open, Barry framed in the entry, his face red and sweating, his hand reaching for hers. Jill lunged forward and he grabbed her wrist, literally jerking off of her feet and into the corridor. They crashed to the door. They crashed to the floor as behind them the door was crushed off its hinges. Wood and metal squealed as the ceiling continued smoothly down, the door snapping in a series of harsh cracks. With a final resonating boom of impact, the ceiling met the floor. It was over. The house again as silent as a tomb. They staggered to their feet, Jill staring at the doorway. The entire frame was filled with the solid block of stone that had been the ceiling, at least a couple of tons of rock. Are you all right? Barry asked. Jill didn't answer for a moment. She looked down at the shotgun she still held in her trembling hands, remembering how confident she'd been that there had been no trap, and for the first time she wondered how they were ever going to make it out of this hellish place. Ah, no, Jill's sandwich reference. How disappointing. They stood in the empty front hall, Chris pacing the carpet in front of the stairs, Becca standing nervously by the banister. The massive lobby was as cold and ominous as when Chris had first seen it, mute walls giving away none of their secrets. The stars were gone, and there were no clues as to where or why. From somewhere deep in the mansion, there was a heavy rumbling sound, like a giant door being slammed. They both cocked their heads, listening, but it wasn't repeated. Chris couldn't even tell from the direction it had come. Terrific. That's just great. Zombies, mad scientists, and now things that go bump in the night. Priceless. He smiled at Rebecca, hoping that he looked less rattled than he felt. Well, no forwarding message. I guess that moves us to Plan B. What's Plan B? JC. No Jill sandwich line. 0 out of 10. Would never read again. LOL joking. Yeah. Anyways, what's Plan B? Chris sighed. Hell if I know. But we can start by checking out that other room with the sword key. Maybe we can dig up some more information while we wait for the team to reassemble, a map or something. Rebecca nodded as they headed back toward as they headed back for the dining room, Chris leading the way. He didn't like the idea of exposing her to further danger, but he didn't want to leave her alone either. At least not in the main hall. It didn't feel safe. As they passed the ticking grandfather clock, something small and hard cracked beneath Chris's boot. He crouched down and scooped up a dark gray chunk of plaster. There were 2 or 3 other fragments nearby. Did you notice these when we came through before? He asked. Rebecca shook her head, and Chris ducked down, looking for more of them. He didn't remember if they'd been there before either. On the other side of the table was a broken pile of the fragments. They hurried around the end of the long table past the elaborately decorated fireplace, stepping in front of the shattered pile. Chris nudged at the gray pieces with the tip of his boot. From the angles and shapes, it appeared to have been a statue of some kind. Whatever it was, it's garbage now. Is it important? Rebecca asked. Chris shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. Worth a look anyway. In a situation like this, you never know what might turn out to be a clue. The echoing tick of the old clock followed them back to the hall door and into the smell of decay that filled the tight corridor. Chris pulled the silver key out of the pocket as they headed right and stopped, quickly drawing his Beretta and moving closer to Rebecca. The door at the end of the hall was closed. When they left, it had been standing open. There was no sense of being watched, of movement in the hall, but someone must have come through while they'd been in the lobby. The thought was disconcerting, reaffirming Chris's uneasy feeling that secret things were happening all around them. The dead creature to their left was in the same position as before, its blood-filled eyes staring blindly at the low ceiling, and Chris wondered again who had killed it. He knew he should examine the corpse and the unsecured area beyond it, but didn't want to go off on his own until he got Rebecca somewhere safe. Come on, he whispered, and they edged to the locked door, Chris handing the key to Rebecca so that he could watch the hall for attackers. With a soft click, the intricately paneled door was unlocked, and Rebecca gently pushed it open. Chris could feel that the room was okay, even as he did a quick check and motioned for Rebecca to step inside. It was set up like a piano bar, a baby grand dominating the floor across from a built-in counter, complete with stools bolted along its length. Perhaps it was the soft lighting of or the muted doors that gave it such an atmosphere of calm stillness. Whatever it was, Chris decided that it was the nicest room he'd encountered so far, and maybe a good place for Rebecca to stay while I try to find the others. Rebecca perched herself on the edge of the dusty black piano bench, while Chris did a more thorough search of the room. There were a couple of potted plants, a small table, and a tiny alcove behind the wall where the piano was situated, a couple of wood bookshelves pushed in back. The only entrance was the one they'd come through. It was an ideal spot for Rebecca to hide. He holstered his weapon and joined her at the piano, trying to choose his words carefully. He didn't want to scare her with the suggestion that she stay behind. She smiled up at him hesitantly, looking even younger than she was, her spiky red bangs adding to the impression that she was only a child who got through college in less time than it took you to get your pilot's license. Don't patronize her. She's probably smarter than you are. Chris sighed inwardly and smiled back at her. How would you feel about staying here while I take a look around the house? Her smile faltered a little, but she met his gaze evenly. Makes sense, she said. I don't have a gun, and if you run into trouble, I'll just slow you down. She grinned wider and added, though if you get your ass kicked by a mathematical theorem, that don't come crying to me. Chris laughed, as much at his own faulty assumptions as at her joke. She wasn't one to be underestimated. He walked to the door, pausing as his hand touched the knob. I'll be back as soon as I can, he said. Lock the door behind me and don't go wandering off, okay? Rebecca nodded, and he stepped back into the hall, closing the door firmly behind him. He waited until he heard the bolt drawn and drew his Beretta, the last trace of a smile fit falling away as he started briskly down the corridor. The closer he got to the rotting creature, the worse the smell. He took shallow sips of air as he reached the body, stepping past it to see if the hall continued on before he examined it for bullet holes. And he stopped cold, staring at the sickened corpse stretched out in the alcove, headless and covered in blood. Chris studied the slack, lifeless features of the face that lay a foot away, recognizing them as Kenneth Sullivan's, and felt a surge of anger and renewed determination to sweep through him at the sight of the Bravo. This is wrong. All wrong. Joseph, Ken, probably Billy. How many others have died? How many more have to suffer because of a stupid accident? He finally turned away, striding purposefully toward the door that led back to the dining room. He'd start from the main hall, checking every possible path that the stars could have taken and killing every creature that got in the way of his search. His teammates weren't going to have died for nothing. Chris would see to it if it was the last thing that he ever did. Rebecca locked the door after Chris left, silently wishing him good luck before walking back to the dusty piano and sitting down. She knew that he felt responsible for her and wondered again how she could have been so stupid dropping her gun. If At least if I had a gun, he wouldn't have to worry as much so much. I may be inexperienced, but I went through basic training just like everybody else. She traced a finger aimlessly across the dusty keys, feeling useless. She should have taken some of those files from the storage room. She didn't know that there was much more to be learned from them. But at least she'd have something to read. She wasn't very good at sitting still, and having nothing to do only made it worse. You could practice, her mind suggested brightly, and Rebecca smiled a little, gazing down at the keys. No thanks. She'd suffer through 4 long years of lessons as a child before her mother had finally let her quit. She stood up, looking randomly around the silent room for something to keep her occupied. She walked to the bar and leaned over it, but only saw a few shelves of glasses and a stack of napkins, all thinly coated with dust. There were several liquor bottles, most of them empty, and a few unopened bottles of expensive looking wine on the counter beyond the bar. Rebecca dismissed the thought of even as it occurred to her. She wasn't much of a drinker, and now wasn't exactly the best time to tie one on. Sighing, she turned and surveyed the rest of the room. Besides the piano, there wasn't much else to see. There was a single small painting of a woman next on the wall to her left, a bland portrait in a dark frame, a slowly dying plant on the floor next to the piano, the leafy kind she always saw in nice restaurants, a table that extended out from the wall with an overturned martini glass on top. Considering what she had to work with, the piano was starting to look pretty interesting. She walked past the baby grand and peered into the small opening to her right. There were two empty bookshelves pushed to one side, nothing interesting. Frowning, she stepped closer to the shelves. The smaller one on the outside was empty, but the one behind it. She placed her hands on either side of the end piece and pushed, sliding the outer bookshelf forward. It wasn't heavy or moved easily, leaving a track in the dust on the wood floor. Rebecca scanned the hidden shelves, feeling disappointed. A dented old bugle, a dusty glass candy dish, and a couple of knick-knack vases, and some piano sheet music propped up on a tiny holder. She peered down at the title and felt a sudden rush of warm nostalgia for when she used to play. It was Moonlight Sonata, one of her favorite pieces. She picked up the yellowing sheets, remembering the hours she put in trying to learn it when she was 10 or 11. In fact, it had been this very piece of music that made her realize she wasn't cut out to be a pianist. It was a beautiful, delicate tune, and she'd pretty much butchered it every time she took the bench. Still holding the composition, she walked back around the corner and gazed at the piano thoughtfully. It wasn't like she had anything better to do. And besides, maybe one of the other team members will hear it and come knocking, trying to track down the source of the terrible noise. Grinning, she dusted the bench off and sat down, propping the sheets open on the music holder. Her fingers found the correct positions almost automatically as she read the opening notes, like she'd never given it up. It was a comforting feeling, a welcome change from the horrors inside the mansion. Slowly, hesitantly, she started to play. As the first melancholy sounds rose into the stillness, Rebecca found herself relaxing, letting tension and fear slip away. She still wasn't very good, her tempo as off as ever, but she hit all the right notes, and the strength of the melody more than made up for her lack of finesse. If only the keys weren't so stiff. Something moved behind her. Rebecca jumped up, knocking the bench over as she spun around, searching wildly for the attacker. What she saw was so unexpected that she froze for a few seconds, unable to comprehend what her senses were telling her. The wall is moving. Even as the last notes lingered in the cool air, a 3-foot panel of the bare wall to her right slid upwards into the ceiling, rumbling to a gentle halt. For a moment she didn't move, waiting for something terrible to happen. But as the seconds ticked past in silence, nothing else moved. The room was as quiet and non threatening as before. Hidden sheet music, a strange stiffness to the keys. Maybe they were connected to some kind of mechanism? The narrow opening revealed a hidden chamber about the size of a walk in closet, as softly lit as the rest of the room. Except for a bust and pedestal in the back, it was empty. She stepped toward the opening and then paused, thoughts of death traps and poisoned darts swirling through her mind. What if she walked in and triggered some type of catastrophe? What if the door closed, she was trapped there, and Chris didn't come back? What if you were the only member of the stars who didn't accomplish jack shit on this entire mission? Show some backbone. Rebecca steeled herself against the consequences and stepped inside. looking around cautiously. If there was a threat here, she didn't see it. The plain stucco walls were the color of coffee with cream, offset by the dark wood trim. The light in the small chamber was provided by a window into a tiny greenhouse on her right, a handful of dying plants behind the dirty glass. She moved closer to the pedestal at the back, noting that the stone bust on top was of Beethoven. She recognized the stern countenance and heavy brow of the Moonlight Sonata's composer. The, the pedestal itself boasted a thick gold emblem shaped like a shield or a coat of arms, about the size of a dinner plate. Rebecca crouched down next to the simple pillar, gazing at the emblem. It looked solid and thick, with a vaguely royal design and a paler gold set across the top. It looked familiar. She'd seen the same design somewhere else in the house. In the dining room, over the fireplace. Yes, that was it. Only the piece over the mantel was made out of wood. She was sure of it. She noticed it while Chris was looking at the broken statue. Curious, she touched the emblem, tracing the pattern across the front, then grasped the slightly raised edges with both hands and lifted. The heavy emblem came away easily, almost as if it didn't belong there, and behind her the secret door rumbled down, sealing her inside. Without hesitating, she turned and placed the emblem back in its hollow, and the section of the wall rose again, sliding up smoothly on hidden tracks. Relieved, she stared down at the heavy gold emblem, thinking. Someone had rigged all this up in order to keep the metal hidden, so it had to be important. But how was she supposed to remove it? Did the one over the fireplace also reveal a secret passage? Or is the one over the fireplace the same size? She couldn't be positive, but she thought it was, and she knew instinctively that it was the right answer if she switched the two of them, using the wood emblem to keep the door open and placing the gold one over the mantel. Rebecca headed back into the room, smiling. Chris told her to stay put, but she wouldn't be gone more than a minute or two, and perhaps when he got back she'd have something to show him, a real contribution towards solving the secrets of the mansion, and proof that she wasn't so useless after all. Hmm, yeah, yeah, yep, I'd say I agree with that. Well, any, yep, so that's it for chapters 6 through 10. We'll continue more of it on Monday night. Yep. So thanks for those who tuned in. Thanks to JC Armitage, Attack Helicopter Cat, and Jeff Baum. Shame Otaku wasn't here, but oh well. Anyways, thank you for joining in tonight. Uh, See you next time. See you on Monday night, where the excitement will continue. Woohoo! Yep. Good night.